Greetings. Today we're going to take a look at how you can create instruction pages that you can scroll forward and backwards in PsychoPy. Now, if you've made experiments in PsychoPy before, you know that typically you need to place routines along a timeline and things march forward. And so if you have an instruction screen early in the timeline and you move on to a second instruction screen, there's not really an easy way to get back to the previous one. I'm going to show you a technique today using two loops that will allow you to set up instruction screens where subjects can move forward and backwards. And this can be particularly handy if you've got a complicated task and you need to present some complicated instructions to subjects. Now, to get started, I've gone ahead and created a pretty empty experiment here, which we'll be working on. And I've set up a handful of slides that we'll be using as instruction slides. In fact, I'm going to get rid of that slide 1 there because there's nothing on it. So if we open up these instruction slides, you can see that these are pretty bare bones instructions. These are really just placeholders. Now, this routine here is going to be my instruction slide. So I'm going to rename it, and I'm going to insert an image object here, and I will call this image instruct, and I will have this presented on the screen for an infinite amount of time, and this image is going to hold my instructions. Now, rather than hard coding each of these instructions into one of these image objects, we're actually going to create a condition file. So we'll create a new Excel file here, and I will call this instruction slides. And now in here, I will have a variable called instruct slide. And now we need our actual slide names. So slide 2.png, slide 3, slide 4, slide 5. So I'm just going to add those file names in here. And in fact, we can just do this, and we can rename 3, 4, and 5. So my variable instruct slide is going to be loaded out of this condition file, and it will, in order, give me the 4 instruction slides that I'm going to be using in my task here. So I'll go ahead and save this file and minimize that now. So I'm going to insert a loop around this routine, and I will call this my instruction slide loop. I want to read in my instruction slides, and I want to read these in order. So I'm going to change the loop type from random to sequential because you don't necessarily want to read your instructions in a random order. I'll uncheck is trials, but you could leave that checked. It won't really affect things. And I'll set number of repetitions right now to 1. And the last thing I'm going to do is add one button here, which I will call my button next. So I will say next. And I'm not going to add any code or anything right now. And we'll see how you can actually have both a next and a back button shortly. But I'm just going to put in some dimensional values, and I'm going to move this over to the side of the screen and down on the screen. In fact, I'll make this a little less tall. And I also need to make sure this button lasts forever. Okay, if I run my experiment now, what we will see here is... Oh, actually nothing, because I forgot to do one key thing, which is actually refer to the variable that I'm loading from my loop here. So instruct slide is the variable that's coming in that's containing my instruction slide image. So in my image component here, this has to be set to instruct slide so that it pulls in that variable. And we also want to change this to set every repeat. If you have this set as constant and you try to run your experiment, it will crash and it will say instruct slide doesn't exist yet. That's because instruct slide doesn't exist until this loop begins, and therefore we can't set this image until we're already inside the loop. Constant means you will try to set this image at the very beginning of the experiment, so before you've even entered the loop here, and so things will not work. So we're going to change this to set every repeat, and this will make sure we're updating our instructions as we go. I'm going to adjust one other thing, and that is I'm going to go into the screen property here from the properties menu and uncheck full screen, just so that my experiment doesn't necessarily run in full screen mode anymore. And now when we click go, now we're in a windowed mode, and you will see instructions 1, instructions 2, instructions 3, instructions 4. So the next button works easily. My instructions aren't scaled properly. We could fix that. I'll show you how to do that in a moment. But more importantly, how do you get a back button? How do you actually go back in a loop? So first, let's look at the instruction scaling. So the size, we want to make this image a little taller probably, and a little wider. So something in the realm of 0.9 and 0.75 for width and height is probably enough. Again, enough at least for our demonstration purposes. You could get in and fine-tune the size of your instructions if you want. One other thing I'll show you is, because our instructions are on a white background, we might want our screen itself to be on a white background rather than a gray. So if you come into the experiment properties, by default, PsychoPy experiments are pure gray background. That's 0, 0, 0. If you want a white background, it's 1, 1, 1. If you want a black background, it's -1, -1, -1. So we'll set our background to white. Okay, let's go ahead and also add in a back button now. And we'll adjust its layout and appearance. I want to make it symmetrical to what we had here. So 0.2 and 0.08 is the size. So 0.2, 0.08 is the size. And the next button was at 0.5 coordinates to the right. I'm going to make the back button at -0.5 coordinates to the left. And the vertical position is still 0.4 coordinates down from the center. That's how you read these PsychoPy coordinates. So just doing a visual check here by running the experiment again, we can make sure that the scale of the instructions and the back and the next button look okay. And we have a nice white background now. So there you go. Instructions, next. Now notice back also precedes the instructions forward. So the next step is basically going to be adjusting what happens when you click next and back so that we can actually go back and forward. So what I would like to do in this loop here is control which entry I'm on. There are 4 rows in our Excel file, if you'll remember. So bringing the file back up, you can see instruct slide has 4 different rows. I would like to choose which row to show each time we go through the loop. And you can actually control this using the selected rows variable. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to manipulate how we select which instruction screen to show by inserting a variable in here. So for instance, if you just wanted to show the first slide, you could set selected rows to 0. And if we did that, the experiment would show the first slide, and when we click next, this whole loop would end and we would start the experiment. We could select row 1, which would select this slide, or we could select row 2, which would select this slide, or row 3, which would select this slide. And there is no row 4 because it's blank. So in our case, we have 0, 1, 2, and 3. You're going to need to know how many slides you actually want to show to subjects and how to count them in order to control which slide is actually being shown. Okay, so we're going to insert a larger loop around this smaller loop. And we'll call this our instructions controller. And again, is trials doesn't need to be selected, but we will. This loop is going to have a really high number of repetitions. You can make this as high as you want, practically speaking. You know, this is as high as you need to go. Technically, it's not an infinite loop, but no subject is going to go through 9,999 times. So this is enough. So we'll just set our controller to last this long. And we're going to insert a helper routine, and we'll call this instruction prep. And we will insert this in the controller loop ahead of the actual instruction slide, but still within the controller loop itself. And in this prep routine, all we need is a bit of code. Okay, so let's start very simply. At the beginning of the experiment, I'm going to create a variable called current row, and this will be the current row from the instruction list that I'm going to be showing. And I'm going to create another variable called button pressed, and I'll set this to none by default. And this variable will be used to detect whether we've pressed the next or the back button. Next, what I'm going to do is say that at the very beginning of this routine, if button pressed is equal to next, then the current row of instructions that we're showing is going to increment by 1. Alternatively, if button pressed is equal to back, then the current row that we're showing should go down by 1. And button pressed should revert back to none after doing its checks. Now, this means that current row will start at 0. And so if we go into our instruction slide loop, we actually want the selected row to be the current row. And we're just going to force this current row variable to be interpreted as a string by adding the str around the current row. And this is just due to how PsychoPy is expecting the selected rows to come in. It's expecting either a string or a slice object. So we're going to send it the current row as a string. So again, this value starts at 0. Next, what we're going to do is when the next button is pressed, we're going to have the button pressed variable become equal to next. And when the back button is pressed, then we want the button pressed variable to be equal to, not black, back. Okay, let's see how this works so far. So we should now have a next and a back button that will allow us to scroll through the instructions forwards and backwards. So next. Okay, next button used to do that. What happens when we click back? We go back, and we go back. We can go forward, 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 back, back, back. So we can now scroll forwards and backwards in the instructions. However, if you scroll back too far, if we press back again, the experiment will crash. And if here we press next again, the experiment will also crash. And so if we click back, sorry, actually it loops around. Oh, and now it crashes. So yeah, it doesn't work quite right just yet. So what's happening is if we press back too much, the current row actually turns negative. And so we want to insert a check here. If current row is less than 0, and current row is equal to 0. This will make it so that if somebody presses back on the very first screen, we don't go into a negative current row, we just stay on that first slide. And if the current row is greater than the total number of slides that we have, let's just say max slides right now, then we actually want to end this instruction phase. So if we are on the final slide and we press next, current row counts up, we're now past the total number of slides that we've got. We actually want instructions controller, the loop, to end. So instructions controller finished is equal to 1. Note though that we're doing all these checks right here. So if we realize somebody's pressed next, we're gone past the end of our instructions, we want to actually end this loop, we can set this loop to terminate, but then the experiment will march onward and the loop will only end here. So we somehow have to skip showing any slides to subjects when we want to end things. So let's have another variable here that we'll call do instructions, or in fact, let's call it show instructions, and we'll set it to 0. At the very beginning of our experiment, let's set show instructions to 1. And what we can do for the instruction slide loop is rather than have one repetition, we can set it to the variable show instructions. So this variable is equal to 1 until we press forward so many times that we've gone past the maximum number of slides. Then it is equal to 0. The last thing we need to know is how many slides we have in total, and we'll set that at the beginning of our experiment as well. Now remember, this is slide 0, this is slide 1, this is slide 2, this is slide 3. So if we go past 3 slides, then we want to end. So slide 3 is our last slide, even though we're actually showing 4, because again, this is slide 0. If we click OK and run the experiment now, we should have instructions that can go both forward and backwards, don't crash PsychoPy, and proceed onward when we actually reach the end. So first, back, no longer crashes. Forward, goes forward. We can go back whenever we want. And if we press next, we I think ended the experiment. Let me just double check that we didn't crash anything. Okay, actually, no, that was crashing the experiment. I'll show you why in a second. I added a routine here, just a dummy routine with a text component here that just said, this is the experiment. So I could tell if I was exiting the loop correctly, and I wasn't. And you need to add just a little more code over here. So when we check if we're past our maximum slides, we're going to terminate the loop and everything like that. But we also have to set the current row back to a valid number. So we're past the maximum number of slides, so we'll set the current row to be equal to the maximum number of slides so that even though this loop is being skipped because there are no repetitions, it still tries to select the rows out of the Excel sheet. And if you give it a row that is beyond its range, it will crash. So with that one little code addition, we can now see the instruction section in action. So forwards, backwards, forwards, backwards, doesn't crash, forwards, into the experiment. The one other modification you can make to this is right now, when we are selecting our rows, we are using the Python command to take current rows and turn it into a string. Let's actually change this to current row string, a new variable. And here in the code, after we do all the sorting out about what the current row should be equal to, we set its limits. Down here, I'm going to say current row string is equal to string current row. The reason I did that is because the online code for taking current row and turning it into a string is not str with the current row variable. It's current row dot to string. If you had tried to run this experiment online, having str cur row like this, it might not have worked for you. PsychoPy might not have translated that correctly. So this is just a safer way of ensuring that you've got a string in there, and then you can see over here how the JavaScript is going to come out, and it's coming out correctly. So it's just a slightly safer way of coding to make sure that your experiment is online compatible. But if you want to run this locally, you don't have to make that change. And this is all the code you need. So again, here's the code from the beginning experiment screen. Here's the code from the begin routine screen. And then for your buttons, you simply need to set the button pressed variable to next or back. And other than that, the rest will take care of itself. So hopefully you found this tutorial handy. And other than that, thanks for watching. If you do need professional PsychoPy help or consulting, I do offer consulting services. The link for my website and information about those services can be found below. Good luck with your research, folks.